Okay.
We're live. Cool. How are you, Matt?
Good, good. How
Okay,
you doing?
okay. All right. Uh, wow. So we're, the thing is, I've been reading slowly. I haven't been reading much. I've been doing a lot of work. As you know, the semester's begun, and I happen to be reading a couple students' theses. And so that's what's been slowing my progress on reading this stuff. And of course, I have to read all the other stuff that I typically read for the work that I do. And then, that and all the other, number of things that one does as one proceeds through one's life that is slowed my reading. And so anyway, Matt, we are discussing the last section of chapter 24, and then we'll begin chapter 25 next week, discussing chapter 25, and that'll be the last chapter. That's something. Anyway, I'd like to do something here. I'd like to provide a synthesis of the synthesis that is here in this particular section. And I'd like to work my way to it so that we can see the pertinence, the utility, the use value, as a matter of fact, of this particular work for folks today and for Chicana and Chicano workers today. And so if you give me I figure it's going to be about 6 or 7 minutes to read through my notes, and then I'd like to get your response, and then we can proceed on the basis of this presentation.
All right,
is that all right?
Yes.
All right. Well, let me begin by saying, let me turn to the actual, because I want to give the title of the section to folks that are following along. And the title of the section of chapter 24, of course, the title of chapter 24 is the conversion of surplus value into capital. And in this particular section, it's called the so-called labor fund. And what Marx does is he begins by critiquing then existing discussions of the labor fund, and he does so in order to set the record straight. He essentially says that the material of variable capital, or the so-called labor fund, was fabled as a separate part of social wealth. To set in motion the part of social wealth, he writes, which is to function as constant capital, i.e. technology, a definite mass of living labor is required. In other words, the number of laborers required, rather one of the things that he says is about this requirement is that the number of laborers required is neither given, nor is the price of this labor neither is it also given. And why? Because as Marx writes, it changes with the degree of exploitation of the individual labor power. Now, if Marx makes such distinctions about the inextricability of social wealth from the so-called labor fund, and if this distinction rests on the last two premises, then what differentiates Marx from other economists is that where they turn to God and nature, and that was one of his critiques, of economists at the time, political economists at the time, Marx turns to history and to a scientific and empirically based analysis of the dialectical interactions that exist in history. It's the basis of what distinguishes Marx as a historical economist as opposed to a political economist. The dialectic must be then the central attention of Marxist historians and Marxist social scientists, because there, in the fight, is where the tension between variability and constancy collide, and where technology would displace or has displaced craft in the form, for example, of relative surplus value. And what I mean here is that, you know, as I was reading this stuff and I was thinking about this particular chapter in the section, I was thinking about the work that I did alongside my father growing up. And I think I brought this up before, you know. I used to go to work with my dad on weekends, and in the summer, and I used to tape dry. We used to help him hang and tape drywall, right? And we move to the city of LA, actually to the very city of LA, in the late 60s when I was still an infant. We moved to the city in the late 60s, right? And so as I was coming up throughout the 70s and into the early 80s, of course, I knew this work very well. And one of the things that really struck me about the work of drywall taping and drywall hanging, right, is that there's two categories of tools. There are the hand tools, you know, for instance, that, you know, my dad used to call it la pen. I don't know what its name is in English, but it's a trowel, you know, where the mud is placed, and it's about a 12-inch aluminum box, if you will, right? And then there's the 4-inch blade, the 6-inch blade, the 8-inch blade, the 10-inch blade, and the 12-inch blade. And I believe there's also a 14-inch blade, and that requires a larger trowel. Anyway, and these and one manually prepares the mud, you know, beats the mud in a bucket, right? Adds water, mixes it together, right? And then scoops some of the mud into the trowel, and then spreads the material on the wall in order to what then we might call to plaster the wall, to tape the wall. It's around this time, as a matter of fact, during the it's around the period between 1950 and 1980, as a matter of fact, right, that a couple things are colliding and are in tension with one another. There's a rise, of course, as we know, in the nation, in the United States, and in the region, of course. There's a rise in labor activism and labor organization, right? So it's in that time when my father arrives to the city of LA and begins to work with my uncle, right, that they become members of the Carpenters Union. And there was, I don't see it there now. I think now the Carpenters Union is, or what had been the Carpenters Union now is an apartment complex in Boyle Heights along Soto Avenue, somewhere between Marengo, if folks know the region that I'm talking about, somewhere between Marengo and Cesar Chavez is where the Carpenters Union Hall used to be. But that's not there anymore. And it's around the same time, between 1950, you know, the late 40s and mid 70s or thereabouts, is post-war period, right, that the work of plasterers, right, is radically transformed by way of the introduction of tool technology and innovations that hadn't existed before. And by this, of course, I mean, and folks that know this work or know about this work might be familiar with these terms. I'll explain what I'm talking about in just a bit. It was around the mid 50s, right, that the taping bazooka, the 4-inch mud box, the 8-inch mud box, the 10-inch mud box, and the 12-inch mud box, as well as the mud pump, right, were invented and introduced and used in the production, in the construction industry, in the drywall industry, if you will. Now, by the taping bazooka, what I mean to say is that as drywall boards are nailed or screwed to walls and ceilings, right? There's this long cylindrical tool to which is attached a roll of paper tape, and within this long cylindrical tool is pumped a joint compound, what drywall tapers typically call mud, right? And so that the tape and the mud are simultaneously installed or affixed to the wall in order to seal the joints between the different drywall boards, and in effect, right, eliminating any appearance of the fact that the drywall is affixed to the wall, and that they're separate units. It makes it look all taping it this way makes it look like it's all just one wall, right? Anyway, and then over that tape, of course, one runs the 10-inch mud box, right, to cover the tape. And then, of course, there are electrical sanders, and of course, we didn't use electrical sanders because the quality and the kind of work we do. But now, of course, people use electric sanders to sand the mud or the joint compound, and then, of course, then a series of other. I can get on to I can continue to talk about this work, but the point being is that the kind of work that was done leading up to the Second World War and leading up to the post-war period, and in fact, the kind of work that was done in the construction of homes leading up to the post-war period, which also happens to see the housing boom in the LA metropolitan region, also happens to not only see the housing boom, but change the demographic panorama and the urban environment of the region, right? All this is on one basis anyway, premised on the kind of workplace transformations that are taking place in the LA metropolitan region, right? At the same time that there is a rise in labor organization and activism amongst drywall workers. Anyway, I was thinking about this as I was reading chapter 24 in the last section for a couple of reasons, because of course I always think about the pertinence and applicability of this particular book for Chicano and Chicano people, but because of course of my own background, and about 25 years ago or so I came across Rudy Acuña's book, one titled "Anything But Mexican," and I remember reading, right, about the what he calls the drywalleros, los cartoneros as we call ourselves, los taperos as we called ourselves, the tapers, drywall tapers as we called ourselves also when we spoke to one another in English, right? And so I'm thinking about labor activism and labor transformations, and then production transformations, and if you will, revolutions in production, right, alongside not just the book, but alongside the context of my own personal history and the context of the developments in the industry, right, that was the basis of, our bread and butter as I was growing up. And I hope that folks who might be reading this book with us, or hope that folks that are listening to us at the very least, think about this book in terms of their experiences as working class people, or having been raised in working class homes, okay, especially over the last 30 years or so. In any case, what is the lesson here? And this is, and here I'm working my way towards a conclusion, and I'd really like your response, Matt, here. What is the lesson here? That in the rise of labor activism and union organization, where what Marx calls labor variability, right, capital in one case seeks to contain labor by way of constant capital, such that it can maintain and or intensify rates of exploitation and the generation of surplus value. And I want to talk a little bit about variable capital, and I also want to talk a little bit about constant capital. And to do so, I'd like to just quickly quote from, I think it's chapter 8 I'd like to quote and say, right, that that part of, I'll put on my glasses here. That part of capital represented by labor power does, in the process of production, undergo an alteration of value. It both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and also produces an excess, a surplus value, which may itself vary, may be more or less according to circumstances. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it the variable part of capital, or shortly, variable capital. And then, of course, I'd like to define a constant capital here. That part of capital, then, which is represented by the means of production, by the raw material, auxiliary material, and the instruments of labor, does not, in the process of production, undergo any quantitative alteration of value. I therefore call it the constant part of capital, or more shortly, constant capital. So we return to an earlier discussion of relative and absolute surplus value. One I will modify so that we can contemplate the use value and the pertinence to our work today, its use value and its pertinence to our work today. For example, this is a modification of a particular quote in the work of Marx here in Kapital. For example, suppose a plasterer with given tools plasters in one day of 12 hours one 1,500 square foot house. If he must plaster twice as much in the same time, the productiveness of his labor must be doubled. And this cannot be done except by an alteration in his tools or in his mode of working, or in both. Hence, the conditions of production, i.e. is revolutionized. By increase in the productiveness of labor, we mean generally an alteration in the labor process of such a kind as to shorten the labor time for the production of 3,000 square feet of walls, and endow a given quantity of labor with the power of producing a greater quantity of houses. And then I finish with this particular question for you, Matt, that you can answer directly or indirectly, certainly for folks to think about. Who are drywall tapers in the LA metropolitan region since the late 60s and early 70s, given the dramatic demographic shifts that took place in the region in the decade of the 1970s? Right. So who it is we're talking about when we're talking about capital in the more theoretical terms, and who it is we're talking about when we're seeking to understand its usefulness in our day-to-day existence. We're talking about ourselves, right? And we're talking about ourselves as workers, or the children and grandchildren of people who sustain injury, sustain danger, to put food on the table. Anyway, your thoughts, Matt, about this?
Wow. Well, so much of chapter 25 is really about, he's really kind of going over some of the things he said earlier, but he's also kind of refuting his would-be critics and people who would object to what he is saying. So
yeah,
that's kind of my initial thoughts of the chapter. But listening to you bring it to life. It really seems. That was really powerful. So, I'm kind of like, I was listening to respond, but I was also just listening. Yeah, the fact of the matter is that we really, when you talk about adding adding drywall to a home, right? Well, why do houses cost as much as they do? Well, the costs are all inflated. They all go to like the housing market. They go to Wall Street and they get, you know, bet on derivatives against derivatives, and bet against a bet against a bet, right? But at the ultimately, they cost what they cost because it's the material plus the labor to build it, right? So that ultimately can be reflected back to, you know, to that. And so the people that are actually going out and building the drywall, you know, they're getting paid a wage to do it, and then after that, the price of their wages, you know, from there is where the retailer gets a, you know, where not retailer, the realtor gets, you know, part of their commission. That's where, I mean, that's where the you know, not the real estate agent, but the realtor, the real estate company, you know, that's where they're drawing their profit from. That's where the banks are drawing their profit from. It's actually ultimately from the hand of the laborer that is actually building the home. I mean, it's out of the pocket of the home buyer, but it's from the labor of the actual workers. And that process that Marx describes as a factory and a commodity is no different. It's not really that different from the process of building homes, and definitely definitely the drywall worker is a part of that process.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, as you're saying that, I'm just thinking about like all the other elements, you know, the fencer, the you know, the glass, you know, the people, you know, fence boat makers, and the people who build the glass, and all this different proletarian labor, to build homes that the people who are working on them, and in some cases could afford to, and other cases could never afford to live in. I mean, think about like these people.
That's so true. That's so true. You know, one of the things that I think about, you know, the changes that have taken place over the span of the last 50 years in terms of the purchasing power, to use, you know, this common term that is typically used. The purchasing power of working class people has dropped significantly, and, you know, of course, hell, the purchasing power of people with titles, academic titles and such, has also dropped significantly. You know, to go off on a somewhat of a separate topic for just a few moments anyway, you know, one of the claims, and one of the, not just a claim, but one of the bases for the labor activism of organized, one of the few remaining labor organizations that work specifically with the academic community, and I'm talking here specifically about the California Faculty Association. One of the basis of their labor organization and activism, right, is to generate an income from the California State University system, such that its employees can buy homes in the very communities where they work. And I think about this sometimes, and I think about the fact that I remember when I was helping CFA, the California Faculty Association, do in a recruitment drive about 6 or 7 years ago. One of the guys that came to speak to the folks at the meeting was mentioning that he, with his PhD, was unable to buy a home where his immigrant father, packing meat, you know, I think he was packing meat in one of the Midwest, you know, a Mexican man, of course, had made the trip from his town in Mexico, somewhere, I forget, it must have been Kansas, I think it was, or somewhere in the north of Texas area. In any case, he was able to buy a home, you know, for his family, and raise his family in this particular home on the salary that he was making, you know, in the late 60s and early 70s, you know, butchering and packing meat in the, you know, in the Midwest somewhere. And these things are paralleled. I don't know how extensively, but I know, for instance, that the level of educational attainment prior to the 1970s and prior to the mid 60s was a lot less than it has been over the last 20 or 30 years. But it's when you look at those diagrams, those line diagrams, right? So that the purchasing power of people with education, with greater amounts of education, has dropped. At the same time that the levels of education, right, have increased in society, and so that there's this contradiction. That we might consider and contemplate in terms of the information that we're learning from this book. That is, that as we are gaining the skills and the training to make use of the various tools and the technology, so that we can have some expertise with the introduction of digital technology or drywall taping technology, right? Our capacity to generate an income to maintain, a level of existence for ourselves and for our family members has correspondingly dropped in the very city that is second only to the number of Mexican people. I mean, it sounds hyperbolic to say, in the world, of course, because only Mexico City has more Mexicans than the city of LA. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and people don't really. I mean, people are kind of baffled here, but it's also true that the United States of America is the world's second largest Spanish-speaking country, and it's not.
Yeah.
Can't wrap their mind around. And I think that when we're talking about that, and then we're talking about the real. It's kind of. I mean, we're living in really bizarre times. I mean, when you say this to me, that Los Angeles is the world's second largest city in terms of Mexicans, and I think about the United States of America is the country's the world's second largest Spanish-speaking country. When we hear those pieces of information, then we see how the culture and society is reflected back to us. There's just a major disconnect, and in many ways, I think that that's probably why. I mean, that's probably a lot of why what you're saying just it doesn't. It sounds like it cannot possibly be true because of the way in which
Mm-hmm.
not only is the country reflected back to not just us but to everyone, but the way in which the city of Los Angeles is reflected to the majority of people in this country. I mean, you would look at films about LA and think that it had roughly the same demographics as, like, I don't know, Milwaukee or something like that. That it'd be like maybe like 75% white, maybe 20% black, and then 10% everybody else, right? But that's not the case at all. That's not the case at all. And that reality, it's not just, and in many ways, I think that reality is not just that it won't be reflected, or it's not reflected back because, well, they don't know the market or this or that, the other. I mean, we gotta understand that the corporations that work in what's called the entertainment industry are not just they're not just corporations. They're actually uh, major. They have a responsibility to the larger society to maintain whatever kind of superstructure is being put forward, right? So they're not just major corporations. They're also kind of pillars of communication in a racist society that is going to deny the realities of this demographic shift. So, in many ways, I think that what we're going to see is further and further reaction about the on-the-ground realities, about the fact that the town is so full of Mexicans, the fact that the country is becoming increasingly so full of Mexicans, and they are being exploited, and they're being stepped over, and they're being denied educational opportunities, and they're being denied education to advance as workers within the economy. And even when they are allowed educational opportunities, they are still being denied these things. They will still, like, maybe enter into different realms of the labor sector, but they're still going to get exploited at a higher rate. All kinds of things are going to continue to go on. But there's going to be this cultural denial of their presence. I mean, there's going to be consistent denial, even to present them lowly, even to present them in a poor way, a bad way, in a demeaning way, in a disparaging way. That won't happen because they will not be represented in their numbers, because the control of how many Mexicans there are in any part of America is not just it's not a new phenomenon. It's actually the phenomenon. It is actually the central phenomenon of the Chicano experience, which is to be pushed and pulled out of the country, which is to be made to feel, and made to be perpetually foreign, so that you can be perpetually exploited at a higher rate. That is the central phenomenon of the Chicano experience in the United States of America. So that kind of the fact that this is still happening, the fact that it's happening even under a changing demographic, even when people are staying, because if you look at like the history of the development of the Southwest, it is all based upon bringing Mexicans, kicking them out, bringing them out, and bringing them, kicking them out, bringing them, kicking them out, and this is not a breathtakingly new point that I'm making here. I mean, this is like with the Repatriation Act, Operation Wetback. I mean, a whole kind of thing. It's not until the '90s that people like start coming and start staying and really in huge millions of numbers. When that happens, there's an enormous shift in perspective and and people that are like here and here to stay and not going anywhere, and it's not seasonal, and you're not going to push us out, and and that creates a different form of organization, that creates a different form of consciousness. But society will not reflect that, because too many Mexicans, because the old thing stands, too many Mexicans in the United States of America makes it not the United States of America.
Yeah.
And they're not going to do it. They're not going to allow that reality to be reflected back to not just our population, but any population within the United States.
I think that one of the central values of the book, the work that we've been doing and discussing, over the last year, as it turns out, is that we are challenged to examine history, and we are challenged to examine tangible, quantifiable, empirical events, and arrive at conclusions about the material world around us. And as Marx critiques in this particular section, not turn to God or to the apparent naturalness of things in order to understand the world around us, right? But to examine the tensions and confrontations that have taken place over the different periods in history, in order to understand then how it is we got to where it is we have arrived. And so I want to ask you, on the basis of this very important premise in this book, how do you suppose we ought to contemplate and understand an exclusively race-based understanding of the Chicana and Chicano experience in the LA metropolitan region, right? And the reason that I'm asking this question is because you turn our attention to the media industry. You turn our attention to the fact that the media industry constitute, right, very important pillars, very important and certainly monopolizing channels of communication, information, and dissemination about the world around us. Right, indeed, right. These channels of communication, information, etc., over the years have either painted Mexican people as subservient, as certainly as unimportant, if they've represented them at all. How are we to understand then these, this apparent cultural dynamic in the face of, the tension between labor and capital, and the role that Chicano and Chicano people play within that tension?
Well, it's intended in many ways to remain an invisible workforce. It is an invisible. It's not like a naturally invisible workforce. It is an invisibilized workforce.
Yeah.
It is a workforce that you just don't even think of. You don't consider it to be some type of issue. It's completely naturalized. The position of brown labor within the United States of America is completely. It's damn near depoliticized. I mean, people think of it as not really something that's political. In fact, even people who tend to be advocates for or act as though they are advocates the struggle of brown people in this country. They often talk about, oh, they're going to, the immigrants come in and they do the job that nobody wants, and oh, like they're just working hard, and like they just want to go home, and they're just like anybody. They love their children, and they do this sort of thing, right? And it becomes this kind of just the position that people should be working harder than others, people should be exploited at higher rates is naturalized and normalized. And how dare you stand in their way to want to work so hard for you? Becomes
get in the way of their right to work, quote unquote.
Right. How dare you get in the way of their will to work for you? How short-sighted could you be to to not want to accept this wonderful gift they bring to you? The gift of this labor that they just burning in their hearts to put on your plate. That becomes like that becomes, I don't know, it's like that to them, to in the in U.S. society becomes like a compliment, or becomes like becomes, I mean, what's the trendy word today, allyship or something like this.
But
the actual advocacy, that people should be allowed to work hard for you, and you better appreciate it.
A part of the question that I'm asking is rooted in my own understanding and in a kind of critique that I have, such where people stay within the context of race-based understandings of themselves and of one another and of other people, right? And those understandings are drawn from what they think they see before them. Those understandings are drawn from their reading of the media, their reading of television, I don't know, their reading of Facebook, their reading of certain memes, and certainly channels through which memes are distributed, and draw from these media representations, fabricated as they are, and limit their understanding of the world and of themselves and of their history and of their community to the messages that they receive. Some of these messages, of course, popularize and esteem and glamorize Mexicans en route to achieving the American dream, right? And then that becomes, their point of reference for looking at themselves in the mirror. Some of these channels, representations, demonize Mexicans as bandits, as rapists, as murderers, as drug traffickers. The recent presidential administration notwithstanding, and they also draw on these representations to understand the person in the mirror and other people like them in the mirror. Matt, your response?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's you are inherently these things, and then America can make you a college graduate, right? So this is what you would be otherwise, and here's what America can do for you. It can turn you into a degree on a wall, and that's really what you should strive for. But yeah, I mean, so you're asking like why do people in the community buy it, right? Well, I mean, you got to think though. I mean, like this, what you're describing though is very, it is not just like a Mexican experience. It is the experience of being Mexican in America. It is the experience of being, what we're calling Chicano. I mean, it is the experience of living here in these country, dealing with these people in power, and that is it. And this is not something that this is not what Mexicans experience. Mexicans, Mexican nationals, they experience something different. I mean, I'm not gonna weigh in on what they go through life thinking and experiencing, what the Mexican state or what the bourgeoisie in Mexico tell them. I don't know that as intimately as I know this. I mean, this I know much clearer. So it is to be told what we are here, and in here we are criminalized, we are marginalized, we are forgotten, we are an afterthought, and until it's time to come up with some kind of demon, and then sometimes we take center stage, other times we're part of a crew of demons, But this is what the United States does, and I think it leaves us very confused. Though it leaves us very confused because it's not just the fact that we are often demonized; it's the fact that so often, more often than not, we're an afterthought. And so you kind of grow up in life being an afterthought. You start afterthoughting yourself, and that is really kind of one of the really chief pillars of growing up Chicano in the United States of America is to really kind of almost consider yourself. I mean, you live your life, and you know the people you know, and you think the thoughts you do, and they're not completely subject to what is being said about media or in academia or whatever. But then when you start thinking about the world, when you start thinking about
Yeah.
like the world, and you start thinking about the world at large and your place within it, your reference points to go beyond the community you live in, to start just thinking about, like, you start staring at the stars and contemplating meaning and your place in the universe, then yeah, what you're handed is that you don't really exist, or you do, but it's really as an afterthought, it's really as a sideshow, it's really as some kind of subplot within the American experience, which is largely your understanding of the world and of existence, because it is what has educated you, it is what has bombarded you with images, it is what has bombarded you with theories and ideas about who
Yeah.
you might be. So that becomes largely the question. But so who are you? I mean, so who are you? I mean, well, in many ways, you are many things. You are many things. But if you think about the conditions that we actually find ourselves in, like it varies. But as a group, yes, largely we are the ones who are behind the cash register. We are the ones um, who have hands in the mud plows, of course, it's not like to a person. Of course, it's not every single person. Of course, it's not every single one. But this does kind of define the general position that we find ourselves within, the larger economy. And locating ourselves in that economy, in some ways, is it can be kind of depressing. I mean, it can be upsetting, it can be infuriating, it can be a lot of things. Not necessarily because there's anything wrong with the work, it's just more because this work is low compensated. This work is often highly dangerous. This
Yes.
work is all these things associated with that are not ideal.
I remember reading Rudy Torres's book, a book that he published about 15 years ago or so, and learning in my reading of this, I forget the title of the book, and LA Latino Metropolis. I happen to have it on my bookshelf,
Yeah.
right? And learning about the fact that Latinos in the LA metropolitan region are the most injured workers in the region. Now, I did a study some time ago, and I don't mean to be boasting about myself in this moment. It's just that I was collecting some information, some demographic information about the LA metropolitan region, and I discovered that people of Mexican descent constitute between 65% and 75% of the so-called Latina and Latino population in the region. And so if we're talking about injured workers in the LA metropolitan region who are Latinas and Latinos, odds are we're talking about Mexican people here, right? And to the extent that we are invisible to ourselves, and to the extent that we're invisible to one another, to the extent that we're invisible to other people, it's to that extent that our injuries in the production of use values don't matter. I'm reminded of the meme that is generated every year on Facebook, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, where there's a white family having a holiday meal and they're thanking Jesus, and Jesus, Chewy, in the next meme is saying thank you, right? Where they turn to God for thanks, right? Mexicans must remind, right, that the source of their sustenance is Mexican
Right.
labor. you know.
And everybody knows. See, this is the thing. Everybody knows that. Like everybody knows that, and nobody
Yeah,
thinks anything of it. You know what I'm saying? That nobody thinks anything of it, and nobody thinks
yeah,
that's political. Everyone just that's just normal. You know what I mean? Nobody thinks of it like, oh my God, this is wrong, or oh, geez, this is a travesty, or oh, what a tragedy. Right? Everyone just thinks it's normal. Everyone, you know, I'm saying I'm exaggerating at this point, but I mean, but the reality is that this position, generally speaking, is damn near depoliticized. This is just very like okay, like that's just the way it is, and it's not seen as it's not seen in many eyes as like some injustice. It's not seen in many eyes as even significant. You know, like well, that's not what's important. What's really important is like learning about this one you know, Slavic strike in 1906 when in Pennsylvania. You know, some obscure
yeah,
kind of whatever. Well, that's not what's important. What really matters is that this, that, the other. You know, and so I mean, and that's even if someone's going to talk about labor. Well, the really more often likely to talk about is just
yeah.
somebody tweeting something, and it's someone who's very famous tweeting something, and just becoming more famous by the day because more eyes are on the tweet.
Yeah. Well, so much has transpired over, or so many things. We've talked about so many different things as we've made our way throughout the book, over the last year, and we are approaching, finishing this book right around the time, that the pandemic hit initially, though a year later. And I'm compelled to ask at this moment, Matt, about the economic conditions, the labor conditions, social conditions that contributed, the various ones that contributed to the pandemic. And as some of us anyway, here in LA, I know here in the county, folks are beginning to get their vaccinations. Whether or not we reach herd immunity, as it's called, right? What are we to consider? What things must we take into consideration once we are quote unquote back at work, as quote unquote we had been in the past? What are the things that we are that we should be considering as restaurants open up again, as people begin to do the kind of work that they thought they had been doing a year and a half ago?
Well, if you look at some of what you're talking about, the most injured workers, I mean, you're going to find that replicates itself not just throughout Los Angeles or Los Angeles County or throughout the general region. That replicates itself all across the country, and workplace injury during this pandemic has largely been catching COVID, right?
Yeah.
And so the workplace injury of all these people, the demographics you're describing, show what you would likely find. They are the most likely to catch COVID. They are the most likely to do this in this course because they're the ones that are out working. I mean, the ones most direct face-to-face contact. What's called service work. And the only reason that they're not dying in the highest rates is because it tends to be a young population. I mean, otherwise, the numbers would be off the charts with death if the population that we're talking about didn't skew so young.
Yeah.
I mean, but you're looking at like counties where like, I remember reading something in Virginia where it was like only like 12% were like raza, and like yet 50% of the people catching it were. It's just like, and those numbers replicate all throughout the country, and what we should know is that I'm not a scientist. I can't say I'm a disease specialist. I don't know what the pandemic has in store, but I do know that if there is a second wave, if there is a new wave, if there is a mutation, the people who are going to be most affected are the people who will be most affected by workplace injury, if with or without a pandemic. And so, like, the pandemic is just another form of workplace injury. And so, and as far as injury, injury to one is injury to all. So people should really be more concerned about, about people who are, picking the food and people that are serving them food, the people, at the fast foods, I mean, who's behind the window at the fast food place. I mean, it's not just in the field. It's not just like this romantic idea. I mean, it's not just say romantic, but, oftentimes we think about the field worker and we get this like romantic idea about the, but it's also like, the everyday
Yeah.
cashier. I mean, who disproportionately makes up that population? Who disproportionately makes up these frontline workers? I mean, we all know the answer to it, and and I would encourage people to stop naturalizing that, to stop just thinking that's normal, stop just thinking that, because when you start thinking like that, then you start thinking, yeah, these people are mules, and these people are just here to serve me. These people are, you know, what I'm saying? It's just normal. Like, it's normal that I should go off and get a college education, do this, the other, but it's normal that they be over there. It's just, and again, it's not to diminish any kind of labor. It's just it's the conditions of the labor. Dangerous,
Yeah.
low paid, just dead end. It's not dead end people. They're just forced into dead end jobs. They're not. That's really kind of, you know.
Well, um, some poetic closure.
Well, why don't you talk a little bit more about your dad, about a little bit about this? I'm trying to do something really nice here. I want to do something really cool here, but I just need a minute longer.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll tell you what I'll talk about. Instead of talking about my dad, I'll talk about the about drywall work.
Drywall work.
Well, I'll tell you. It'd be you caught me off guard with that. So I don't mind, to tell you the truth. It's just that I'll tell you that I grew up working with my dad, and as things turn out, taking your son to work, or taking a child to work was not something entirely out of the ordinary for somebody like my dad, because of course he was taken to work as a child by relatives, and so I remember very early on, Matt, since you asked, before he was doing labor, he was he was an assistant to a drywall taper. He was working at a place called Maywood Belford. The place is no longer there. It was, he was, did a service on vehicles there, and I must have been about, and I kid you not, I must have been about 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old, because I think about the car that we had at the time and the car that we used to take to work. And so he'd take me on the weekends to work with him, and then he'd be there for just for a few hours, I suppose, just long enough for me to remember being at work, and that started my my trips to employment with my father. Then of course I joined him at work at different places, and now I think about it, we were traveling around the city, and in a pickup truck that that was driven by the guy that was employing my dad, and I'd come along. I wonder what that experience was like for the guy that was hiring my dad, to have my dad and his son in the pickup truck driving around and showing up to work, with a 9-year-old kid, 8-year-old kid, at work. As things transpired, and as my dad got experience, he started to work on his own, and he got his own truck. And I remember he had a 64, 65 Chevy pickup, and then he had a Ford pickup. And my job, started by reading the Thomas Guide and telling my dad, translating the Thomas Guide into Spanish, and directing my dad to the various, job sites. It must be why I have a very keen interest in mapping the city and mapping ourselves in the city. Because early on, I had to work with maps. I had the Thomas Guide, and I'm sure most folks, younger than 40, don't necessarily know what a Thomas Guide is. But the Thomas Guide was a book that had a map of the city, and you looked up the name of the street in the index, and then you were directed to the page and to the intersecting points on the page where that street was found. And then, of course, you make your way from the freeway, the close by freeway, to that particular spot. And that's so as my dad was driving around town, driving us to work, I was, directing him around the city. So I've come to know the region as far away, before I got to high school, as far away as the Simi Valley. Mm-hmm. And as far south, I suppose you might say, as the Tustin, Anaheim area, and knew the Hollywood Hills, and knew the beach areas. And I'll close this little anecdote, since you asked. One of the recurring memories that I have is going to work in people's homes, and folks, going to work in people's homes as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, and impressing folks with my capacity to use drywall taping tools. Yeah, what's
all right. Okay. What was your dad's name?
I don't know. I'm not gonna share that.
Not gonna share that?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right.
Yeah, because I know we're,
This poem is called Don Prado. Since you won't give me your 5 letters. Don Prado.
All right.
A man beats the mud in a trowel, stirs the mud to plaster. The soles of his shoes, the bend of his spine, the mud box in his hand opens the doors across city grids to mansions and apartments alike. The city is filled with mud huts, built by the hands of workers. Drawing value from their sweat, a boy rides in the back of a pickup. A boy will recall his job as navigator. A man will become a professor and consider his recurring memory of his father's tools. A man will become a professor and consider his ongoing obsession with maps.
Pinchy Matt, man, you're going to bring a tear to my eye. Thank you. Thank you so much. I love it. You got to send that to me.
I will send it to you. I will send it to you as soon as we're done.
All right.
All right.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right.
See everyone next week.
Yes, we'll see you next week.